From the American Neurological Association, I am Ifra Zavar. This is ANA Investigates. ANA Investigates is the official podcast of the American Neurological Association, featuring conversations that highlight the latest discoveries, controversies, and trends in academic neurology. After the successful release of over 80 podcast episodes, in today's episode, we will explore the creation and evolution of the ANA Investigates podcast since its launch in September of 2019. We have the privilege of hosting 4 legends who were instrumental in bringing this podcast to life. First, Dr. Adeline Goss, assistant professor at Highland Hospital in Oakland, California, whose background as a radio host uniquely positioned her to serve as ANA Investigates executive producer for over 6 years. We are also joined by Dr. Richie, associate professor at UCSF, and Dr. Geocadin, professor at Johns Hopkins, both of whom played a central role in shaping the podcast from its earliest days to its evolution. And finally, we are joined by Jennifer Hurley, Education and Accreditation Manager for the American Neurological Association, who has been integral to the editing, production, and sustained success of every single episode. Adeline, Jennifer, Megan, and Romer, thank you so much for joining us today.
This is Adeline. Great to be with you, Ifra.
Hi, Ifra. This is Jen. It's great to be here.
Hi, this is Megan. I'm delighted to join.
And this is Romer. I'm so happy to be back for ANA Investigates again. Thank you.
So, Romer, I'll start with you. What inspired the creation of the podcast, and what gap was it meant to fill in neurology?
So the podcast came about really as a need for ANA. And during that time, I was not really that much involved with ANA. But then Justin MacArthur came to me, who was the incoming president, and said, Romer, are you doing anything? And then he said, do you want to do this? So I proposed to do a needs assessment. And that's when this other wonderful person came to work with me, Jen Hurley. So we crafted a needs assessment survey for the membership. And then we did a heat map. And then we found that the biggest need really was a podcast. So I went to the board meeting and we pitched the idea. It was a string of activities. But the thing that really stuck with the board at that point was the podcast. Jen, did I recall that correctly? Can you chime in?
Sure, of course. It's hard to believe that I think all that started off in, I want to say, January of 2019. And then we launched, of course, our first episode later that year.
And this was actually very, very lucky that we did this because this was just before the pandemic. So we were, in a way, opportune to really set the ANA for a situation whereby online education was established. And that is really the footprint for ANA Investigates and several other online educational platforms. So we were given a very short list, and that included me, Jen, Megan, and Jim Siegler, who has now left. And then one of my said, oh my God, we have to have somebody junior. So I roped in one of my fellows, Mike Halstead, because he got the education award from another organization, AAN. So that's how we formed the committee. There were 5 of us.
And you brought a great team together. Can you share a bit more about the founding team and how each of you shaped the podcast early on?
Let me start because I'm the instigator. I come up with all of these weirdest ideas and then I will go all over the place, but somehow Jen Hurley would pull me down. Megan would talk some sense into me and give structure. And Addie somehow will always make it work. And Jim had all of these experiences that he would pull from everywhere. And then Mike would give this perspective from a junior person. So it became a rounded group.
This is Jen. I love this concept of thinking of Justin tapping you, Romer, on the shoulder, and then you tapping Megan on the shoulder, and Megan tapping Adeline on the shoulder. As, in these early days, as we were thinking about how to create this podcast.
One thing that I remember about the early group that Romer put together and that we expanded was that one thing we weren't lacking in was incredible enthusiasm and interest in really accomplishing something real, something enduring. And I think that all of us were thinking about people who just wanted to put that enduring material down that could be a legacy. And so we just looked for folks that we thought were great colleagues and had something to offer. And I remember thinking about Adeline because of her background in radio, her general outstanding clinical acumen, her amazing conversational skills, and thought she's somebody I'd love to see involved.
Megan, thank you. This is Adeline. This was such a lucky experience for me that Megan brought me into the podcast. I was a resident at the time, working with Megan at UCSF. And as Megan mentioned, I had a previous career as a public radio host and reporter and production assistant. So I was really on a search for some project that would merge my love of neurology with my love of audio and radio. And this was a perfect fit. I mean, as a resident, I was mostly starstruck for the first year or two of working with this team and just completely blown away by the energy and interest in creating something new. In those early months in particular, what I remember and that I hope that we'll talk about more on this episode is just how enthusiastically we experimented with form and experimented with content and really tried to narrow down what it was that we were doing as a podcast, what gaps it filled within neurology podcasts in general, as well as what role it could play within the ANA.
And you guys have done a wonderful job so far, and we hope to be able to continue that. Megan, do you remember the first episode? What was it about, and how did it set the tone for what followed?
I do remember the first episode. I remember the first 2 episodes because we had so much that people wanted to say that we had to split it into 2 pieces, which was an early lesson, by the way. Podcasts are fun and people like to talk, and you end up with more material than you need. So I remember taking on the first episode because I figured, well, no one's going to be too mad at me if I mess it up because at least I volunteered. And so I figured someone's got to do it. And so the way I approached it was, well, if I'm going to be the guinea pig, I really want to choose a topic and guests that I feel comfortable with. We also didn't have the same experience at the time with sort of remote recording. And so we didn't really know how the logistics of these recordings were going to work. What would the quality be like? Would it be conversational or interesting? So in order to make that element a little bit less intimidating, I thought, I'm just going to ask some folks right here at UCSF with me that I can go and see in person and bring some recording gear of my own so that we can record right then and there. And they can be folks that I'm familiar with and I know are doing really cool work. And so that was why I first approached Drs. Michael Wilson and Samuel Pleasure. They were doing some amazing work at UCSF on unbiased diagnostics for infections and CNS autoimmunity. And we just got the 3 of us in a room together with a microphone and tried to make it conversational because we figured, that's probably going to be interesting if we've got an interesting topic between 3 people who know each other. So that was the conceptualization. And I think it made for a complex splicing and mixing on the back end with 3 voices, but Adeline and Jen did an outstanding job.
I'm just going to add to that. I'm talking to the listeners now. If you go back and listen to those episodes, which I encourage you to because they're really great, Megan did such a fine job. The format was actually different from what we settled on ultimately in the podcast, which is mostly like a 2-way conversation between a single interviewer and a single guest. Megan took on a much greater challenge there where she interviewed 2 guests and then scripted a 2-part episode where I basically interviewed Megan and Megan teed up quotes from the 2 guests. And Megan basically overnight became like a real radio reporter and writer. When I say this as somebody who had done this for many years previously, it blew me away. That was a much more laborious process than what we ultimately settled on as a podcast, but sounded really fantastic and is something we've brought back in form a couple times since.
I will definitely go back and listen to that podcast. I'm sure I have a lot to learn from it. Next, I'll turn my attention to Jen. In the early days, what were some of the biggest challenges in launching and sustaining the podcast?
Well, it doesn't feel that long ago, but I guess in the realm of podcast distribution, it was. And one of the biggest challenges that I had is knowing how we were going to actually get the podcast out to the world. Romer mentioned Jim Sigler, who we brought on as part of the early team, who had successfully launched his own podcast. And so Jim really was a coach to me in identifying technologies that could help us to both record and release the podcast. The technology has gotten so much better over time. I would say the biggest challenge I had in the early days, and I still continue to have, is aligning calendars, finding a time that works for all these wonderfully incredible people and their very busy schedules.
Yes, I just wanted to add something. I think one of the key things very early on was, how do we make this podcast distinctly ANA? Because there are dozens of neurology podcasts, but we really thought hard. But then we had to go back to the core of ANA, which is academic neurology, which is really the key. And it's not just anything, it has to be academic. But there was a huge dilemma. Should we go clinical? Should we go basic? Should we go translational? What do we focus on? And this is where, after talking to several really senior and established neurologists, the group decided could we tie this with the ANA, Annals of Neurology Journal, which became a very good incentive, especially for junior people, because at that time we were able to arrange with Cliff Saper and several other leaders of the ANA, of the Annals of Neurology, that the podcast will be subjected to peer review and then will be published. And there will be really a recognition of the interviewer and the interviewee and whoever else participated. And so this became really a peer-reviewed article, which was subject to peer review and validation of the data that came out. It has to be evidence-based, and it has to strike at the core of ANA. So I just wanted to add that as a key differentiation of this podcast.
That is one of my favorite parts about the ANA Investigates podcast. So my next question is kind of a follow-up to this one. It's both from Adeline and Jen. So what really goes into producing a single episode from idea to release? Tell us a little bit more about the production process.
So I'm happy to start with that. So I think just as background, we've alluded to this, but the producers of ANA Investigates are members of the ANA Education Innovation Committee. And most members of that group are not people with experience in radio, audio, or even interviewing. They're neurologists. So the committee meets monthly and brainstorms and identifies the most interesting or urgent episodes for the upcoming months. Then we assign those episodes to individual producers, as we call them, who are members of the committee. We coach the producers as needed to draft questions, email, and invite guests, prep the sort of practice of interviewing and the technical aspects of conducting an interview. Then we have a recording in which generally Jen and I are present along with the producer and the guest. And then Jen makes a file from that, does some preliminary cleanup, and then I have been cutting down episodes to 15 or 20 minutes, which we decided was a pretty digestible unit for the average listener. I record an introduction and outro, and then mix in music, and then share that file with the whole production team as well as the guests, who have an opportunity just to listen in and make sure there's nothing that needs to be changed, which there generally has not been. That whole process generally takes about 2 months, sometimes 3. It's been a big project, and we have done something around over 100 episodes since 2019. But basically, we've been doing this every single month with special episodes, sometimes 2 or more episodes per month, all this time. So it's been a big thrust of multi-producer production now for 6 years.
Adeline, my next question is also from you. As the executive producer, How have you decided what topics are a good fit, and has the podcast evolved over time in terms of format, topic, and audience?
Romer was a champion of this at the beginning. In terms of topics, we have most consistently focused on really the leading edge of neurology and neuroscience, which is the specialty of the ANA as an organization. But even from the beginning, we folded in other topics that were of interest to academic neurologists, topics like implicit bias. We had an episode on fabrication of data and publication, and then also episodes about current debates in neurology. I remember a previous episode from 2022 about what is a TIA. So there's been a mix, but in general, the focus had been what we're adding is talking about cutting edge neurology and neuroscience. A few comments on the format. I mentioned this earlier, but we primarily settled into a two-way conversation format for ease of production of the podcast. But I wanted to just mention a couple episodes that broke form that I really loved. So back in April of 2020, we had a conversation about the personal impact of COVID-19. And several of us talked about our personal experiences of living through the pandemic as neurologists. Romer, you were on that episode, Jim Siegler, Megan, right? And then I remember that you turned it on me and had me comment. I had an infant at the time and was still in residency. So that was a meaningful episode that just broke topic and form and really just made use of this unexpected setting to talk about something real that was happening in all of our own lives. I'm also remembering an episode in 2023 on neurorecovery that was a special episode that was prompted by Buffalo Bills safety Damar Hamlin suffering a cardiac arrest on the field. Romer, you proposed this, that we have a real discussion about prognostication and optimizing neurorecovery after cardiac arrest. And I think that was one of our first breaking episodes that we just pulled together really quickly, as opposed to waiting on a monthly episode. And I love that. That just really symbolizes the energy that the group brought to the show early on and willingness to just sign up and do more work to make something important and timely. And then finally, I wanted to mention that we started in 2023 doing an annual meeting episode, which has just been a lot of fun. Generally, it's been a conversation between the meeting organizer and the chair of ANA, but we've also, most recently in 2025, had Michelle Johansson basically go and do Vox Pop, Woman on the Street interviews of people in the middle of the meeting and created a kind of sound montage. It was really fun to totally break the format of the show and do something different that felt exciting and new. So anyway, I think that openness to changing our format has helped us evolve as a show, and I expect under Ifra and Jen, we will continue to do that going into the future. And then I think finally, just to comment on audience, our central audience has always been ANA membership, but we found early, and especially during COVID, that this podcast has relevance to a lot of people who have no real special interest in neurology. We have many episodes that resonate with people and that illustrate amazing things about the brain and about illness in general, about research in general. And then certainly with the pandemic, there was just fierce interest in anything having to do with COVID. I can't tell you how many emails I got after an episode in which I interviewed Avi Nath about neurologic complications of COVID-19 vaccines. I'm still getting emails about that. So I think we took into account over time that what we were discussing could have relevance beyond the ANA membership, and that we should occasionally really think to do episodes that could extend our reach. And that too has diversified the forum and the content of the show.
Definitely. And hopefully this episode will be one of those breaking the format episodes as well. And ANA Investigates podcast is loved both in general neurology, and it is, like you said earlier, the core of academic neurology, which makes it so popular. So Romer, as Adeline said, you have been the champion of this. Do you want to chime in as well?
Yes. During the early days, we tried to make it very organic. What we did then is we solicited topics from the membership as well as the committee. And then with Jen's help, we were able to create a matrix where we actually track all of the topics with the interviewer and the key areas of neurological subspecialty and see that we cover. And we try to address the hottest topic of that period, of that day. And then would at the same time try to plan out in the longer period whether we have covered all the areas that interest general neurology as a whole field, but still focus on the ANA as the academic neurology core.
So, Megan, in your opinion, how has the podcast influenced education and collaboration within the ANA?
Thanks so much, Ifra. Yes, I think that one thing that we really wanted to be true about the podcast was that it would be something that was being made regularly and people could count on that production to continue so that we had something enduring and real, such that people who participated in the podcast knew that it was going to be something that was going forward, that wasn't just going to sort of die away and was going to continue being an active part of the ANA. I think this was further supported by Romer's idea to actually have some of the podcast episodes turned into actual summaries that were published in the ANA's journals. And I thought that was a magnificent recognition of the enduring nature of what we were producing and the value. And so I think that regular production provided an opportunity for a broad variety of ANA members to kind of participate in their own way. So they could participate by submitting ideas. They could participate by becoming producers of the podcast themselves for a couple of years on the committee. They could potentially be guests. It really became something that, because of its consistency and enduring nature, people really wanted to participate in, and it allowed folks at all levels to really have a chance to make their mark. I also think that because of the regular success of the podcast, it also invited the committee to branch out a little bit into other offerings of educational materials. And so that led to different formats, like a webinar format or a case-based format or a bite-sized learning format, and hence became the Interactin or ANA Highlights, ANA Spotlights, ANA Webinars that allowed us to use a different format than a podcast.
Certainly, ANA Investigates podcast has been very meaningful in a wide variety of ways. So, Romer, what role do you think ANA podcast now plays in the broader neurology ecosystem compared to journals and conferences? And I think Megan started answering that question, but maybe you can elaborate further.
Yeah, a podcast is first and foremost a way of informing, but the other also is a vehicle of teaching and having an impact on education across the sphere of neurology. And I think that is key, where people, rather than reading, would listen. And then, because it is very important, the key thoughts are compressed by the authors themselves. Delivering this to the listeners, in the end, it always has to address the core of ANA.
Thank you so much. So my final question is from Jen. What opportunities do you see for innovation in the future? And where do you see the ANA podcast heading in the next 5 to 10 years? Since you are going to remain an integral part of ANA podcasts, I thought you would be the most appropriate person to end with this question.
Thanks, Ifra. I would love to see some more multi-guest podcasts. While those are challenging from an editing perspective, they are the most fun and I think the most engaging. And I think that works especially well for controversial or highly debated topics like the ones that Adeline had mentioned earlier on. I was also thinking it might be fun, and maybe this is a project for you and I, is to pull in some snippets from some of the old episodes and discuss or comment on what's changed or maybe what hasn't changed. The technology has gotten so much better, and you and I are going to be collaborating into the future on the editing of the upcoming episodes. So that continues to improve. But I'd love to turn this question back around to you. You're our new leader. Where do you see this podcast going in the next 5 to 10 years?
I kind of agree with you that the technology is ever evolving, neurology is ever evolving. So I am open to all sorts of ideas from all the brilliant minds that I work with. And I would love to incorporate more innovative things into the podcast as we move along. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for pulling us together. This is really fun.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Ifra, for the idea.
What a treat. Any excuse to get back together with the old crew, take it again. Thanks so much.
Yes, I want to express my gratitude to everyone My dad used to tell me, you plant an idea, you take care of it, and hope that it grows. I'm so happy that this idea has grown fully. And with your leadership, IFRA, keep it growing into even more beautiful system. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Romer.
That was Dr. Adeline Goss of Highland Hospital, Oakland, California, Dr. Megan Richie of UCSF, Dr. Romer Geocadin of Johns Hopkins, and Jennifer Hurley with the American Neurological Association. ANA Investigates is the official podcast of the American Neurological Association. The show's producers are members of the ANA Education Innovation Committee, chaired by Sarah Nelson and Sharon Ellen Govan. I am Ifra Zawar, the podcast host and executive producer. Our production team this month included Jen Hurley and I. You can listen to past episodes of the show, subscribe to us so you never miss an episode, and access all of ANA's educational programs on the Education tab at myana.org. That is it for ANA Investigates. See you next month.